French.
How's your mother?
She's okay. I was with her last week. She came and joined us for a little 1 week family holiday, and she's pretty frail. She fell a couple times.
That's
I
too
had to
bad.
rent a little wheelchair to move her around, and all that.
That's
So
always rough.
yeah, but she's still spunky and fun and
Yeah.
stubborn and young at heart.
Well, let me
So
give you a proper introduction here, and I'll keep it short because I want to dig a little bit in terms of how you see yourself. Often I've got an author here, and so I've got this kind of thing and so forth, and they teach here and they do that. You're a little more of a wild card, but anyway, my name is Frank Schaeffer, and this is a podcast called In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And today, my guest is an old friend, and he and my family's connections go back into the 1950s.
mhm.
So that's rare. I've certainly never had a podcast guest that I have a connection with into my childhood, and no, no, never. And I don't think that many people are even out there anymore
Mm.
that I could. So Stephen, the way you say his name in American English, Stephen Tchividjian was always Stephan Tchividjian to me because I grew up in Switzerland, and Stephan's father uh, grew up the road from me, and his grandfather was someone who I knew from the time I was about 7.
Mm.
And I knew your mom, Gigi,
Mhm.
from an early age as well. It the connection's always there. I guess our talking point today is we both come from well-known evangelical families. Stephan or Stephen is the grandson of Billy Graham, the evangelist, and I am the son of Francis Schaeffer, the theologian and evangelist. Presently, the Graham family, has changed a bit since my day. Franklin Graham is a controversial political figure. Stephan's mother lives nearby, I think, the Billy Graham Center, and maybe still volunteers there or did recently. So there's too many threads here to put into a nice introduction. So I'm going to start in a weird way today because um, it's really the subject of our conversation is how you and I see each other and the world around us, given our backgrounds. I think that's what we're after today, given that we're
Mhm.
both from evangelical backgrounds. Um, the New York Times once described my family as evangelical royalty in the context of me leaving it as a traitorous prince, the way they put it, who had left the evangelical fold. You certainly come from evangelical royalty, as does your mother. How do you see yourself as we talk today? If someone asked me how I see myself, I'd have two kinds of answers. And I know actually you and I know each other well enough because we've been talking quite a bit that I know this overlaps with yours. They would expect a professional answer. Oh, I'm a writer, I'm a this or that. Um, and I'm not trying to be cute that I see myself as a grandfather first. So this morning, I worked with Jack, restoring some rotten lumber and some pressure treated decking. Then I
Mm.
cooked lunch for Jack, who's 14, and Lucy, who's 15. And I made them pasta con burro parmigiana, which is an Italian dish, kind of family thing. And then we all had lunch. And then I made myself half a cup of coffee to come talk to you. That's who I am. And I
Mhm.
also write books, and I'm known as an author. How do you see yourself right now in your trajectory of being Billy Graham's grandson on one hand, beliefs, all that stuff, but then like who you really are? Let's just start there.
Mm. Well, thanks for that introduction and the great description of your lunch because I've not eaten lunch yet. So I appreciate the
Sorry about that.
imagery and the aroma of such a wonderful, it sounds like an Italian meal. So I
Yeah.
will try to compete later on. Yeah, it's a great, great question. And I'm 60 years old. And I find that at this season in your life, you do find yourself reflective in a variety of ways. Like
Mm.
you, I'm a grandfather. I'm also blessed, like you, to have my grandchildren living within, 5, 6 minutes of me.
Yeah.
So I see them on a regular basis. I'm happily married to my wife of 37 years. I wear different hats on any given day. My mother's still alive, so I wear the hat son,
Yeah.
and then obviously husband and father and grandfather and all that stuff.
Mm.
Um, you referenced, in essence, two of my grandparents. One, the famous evangelist Billy Graham,
Yeah,
and again, if I have to keep reminding people if they're 40 or under, they really don't know who that is, and I just say he
yeah,
was a
yeah,
preacher.
yeah.
Sometimes I'm introduced as Billy Graham's grandson, and I recognize by the blank look
Blank
on
look
people's
on their face. I
faces,
know.
like,
Yeah.
who is that? And I have to remind them it's not the wrestler that was famous by the same name. And then there's
Yeah.
the other grandfather that my namesake is after, Ara Tchividjian, that was a refugee from Armenia, had
Mm,
fled the massacre of the Turks of the Armenians, which is still a controversial topic to this day,
mm,
and
mm.
eventually found himself in Vilar, which is where you and I grew up part of our lives,
In
which
Switzerland.
is common. That I was there 2 weeks ago, and it's still in my blood. But and they're very, very different human beings. I
Yeah.
mean, from one extreme to the other, very, very different. And so, I've always been, and I give my parents a lot of credit that they raised me to have my own identity,
Mm, mm.
even though I'll be introduced sometimes as, oh, Billy Graham's grandson. Sometimes
Yeah.
even before someone even gives them my name. Um,
Yeah.
and I understand that and I get it and all that stuff. But I've always seen myself, first of all, as an individual that is not defined by
Mm, mm.
completely by my heritage or by my family or something like that. Now, I I continue to espouse to be a follower of Christ.
Mm.
But I was not raised in an overtly religious home. So I find that I had a very good example about what it meant to live a Christian life. And it was very much focused on an intimate relationship and very much focused on a relationship that had integrity. So I argue with God on a daily basis. And I was raised to be that way.
Yeah.
So I would say I define myself in my everyday earthly, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a grandfather, I'm
Yeah.
a member of our community, et cetera, et cetera. And on a broader level, I would genuinely call myself a follower of Christ
Mm.
in that sense. And with, I would hope with all the healthy versions of that, even though there's many, many unhealthy versions of that
Yeah.
these days.
Yeah.
So,
And what interests me is that I never lost sight of your family in that your mom and I knew each other from basically pretty well from our teenagerhood
yeah.
when I met her. And she's someone who I've tracked with over the years. And what's been interesting to me about your mother, Gigi, is that after I left the evangelical world and kind of really slammed the door with two books, one a novel called Portofino, which is a work of humor about growing up as the son
Mhm.
fundamentalist missionaries in Europe in the 50s and 60s, modeled very much on my childhood, although the incidents in the book are all fictional.
Mhm.
Um, and then a memoir of mine called Crazy for God that came out that really went into the story of the rise of the religious right and my family's part in it with the anti-abortion movement and so forth. And this is going somewhere. One of the people out of that background, Gigi Graham, Billy Graham's daughter, who kept in touch with me and whose friendship I did not lose as I heard a lot of other doors slam
Mhm.
as an outcast in a way, and gladly so. I don't feel cast out. I cast myself out, but then was treated a bit like a pariah. But your mom, Gigi, is a generous and wonderful person and never seemed to have any problem keeping friends with whom she either disagreed or who had journeyed in a different direction. She's a real woman of the world and
Yeah.
very sophisticated. And
Yeah.
what interests me about your mom, and I know I wasn't planning on talking about this, but I'm going to pick your brain on a little bit, is that she and my mother, Edith Schaeffer, were very much alike in that way. Because
Mm.
I remember my mom, while people were telling me that they were horrified that I'd written Portofino,
Mhm.
my mother asked me for signed copies to give to her friends at the Mayo Clinic where she was living in Rochester because she was proud of me as her son for having a successful novel.
Yeah.
So, what is it about our mothers that they have their faiths and they're pretty much, I would have called my mother's faith pretty evangelical and fundamentalist, and yet a generosity of spirit that is so different from the way we look at what's come to be called Christian nationalism or the evangelical right-wing movement or the Trumpers or the MAGA movement. Your mom is about as far away from that as I can think. And I'm not
Mhm.
talking about how she votes or what she believes, but why was that generation of evangelical women, my mother and your mother, and your mom's a little younger than I was, but nevertheless, you're 60, I'm 72, we're in the same ballpark.
Mhm.
Um, that's a long preamble to say what's happened between the time when Edith Schaeffer could sit down with anybody and talk to them in a friendly manner, and there was never this us versus them. Your mom's the same. I
Yeah.
know that because she invited me to breakfast one time when I was in her neck of the woods, and we had a wonderful morning together, very much in the middle of me being a controversial, quote, anti-evangelical figure as portrayed by some evangelicals. Where did all that come from as the daughter of Billy Graham? Because she didn't walk away from the faith like I did. I left. She
Mhm.
didn't. She stayed. And yet, this generosity of spirit. One last thing. I remember your grandmother being the same kind of person. Um, and Billy's wife um, struck me as part of the same thing. So, where did all that come from?
I think that it's a great preamble. I have great respect for my mother as well as my father who's passed in terms of the way they presented themselves and the way you just described. And that was
Yeah.
very true, not just in public, but behind closed doors.
Yeah.
It's the
And
way.
Billy Graham, too, by the way, a very generous person who I knew not well, but I knew Billy.
Yeah.
And I knew people who knew him well. And Billy, again, very generous. He never was casting people into outer darkness because they disagreed with him.
Yeah, and that was heavily influenced my worldview. It heavily influences me to this day
Yeah.
into that, and I appreciate it. It's one of the greatest things I appreciate about my childhood and about my heritage, particularly coming from my mother and father, and as you
Hmm.
mentioned, and you can't mention Billy Graham without mentioning Ruth Graham,
Well, that's what I was saying. His wife, Ruth, who is my
like you,
mother's dear
like
friend,
your mom. Yeah,
they
and
were
that you
very close, very
get the
close.
two of them together, and I think there was a lot of trouble they could have. You and I have talked about some of the fun adventures you were put on by my grandmother's nudging, but
Yeah.
I I I think it's what made my faith attractive. It made me attractive to the faith because I saw it as genuine and I
Hmm.
saw it as authentic and transparent.
Yeah.
It wasn't as polarizing. It has become to this day the we versus they, the war language that's used constantly from one extreme to the other.
Yeah.
Um, and I believe, I mean, my own take, and I don't understand. I don't like formulas. I don't like,
Hmm.
formulaic faith. I like the fact that I'm free to question. I like the fact that I'm able to agree to disagree. I like the fact that I can look at my plethora of friends and see that they're all over the map in terms of their faith and their politics, and yet they're genuine friends of mine. And I think that's a wonderful attribute. I'm proud of that.
Yeah.
There's something about the messy middle versus the extreme left or the extreme right.
Yeah.
Whenever I meet anybody on the extreme, it always makes me a bit suspicious because they have such surety that they're
Hmm.
they're right about whatever it is that they're right about.
Yeah.
And there's something about the mystery of life, and I find that God has allowed me to live in the messy middle, which
Hmm.
means there's a tremendous amount of mystery on everything.
Yeah.
I remember meeting with my grandfather Graham one time, and he was here in South Florida, which is where I reside. And this was years and years ago. And we were having a hamburger together at a Marriott hotel, which he always loved Marriott hotels. And I had a question about end times.
Yeah.
And all that what Christians call eschatology, which is all about studying end times. And there's all kinds of
All
stuff
this
out there.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and I had this one question, and I referred to him as Daddy Bill. So Billy Graham, we called him Daddy Bill
Yeah.
as grandchildren. I said, "Hey, Daddy Bill, I got this one question about end times," and I asked him the question. He's eating his hamburger, and he looks at me and goes, "I don't know," and he just kept eating his hamburger.
Yeah.
And
There we
we
go.
loved it. Was the most brilliant answer because it was like, you're okay to not know.
Yeah.
And that means I can hang out with people that may have a completely different perspective and yet realize they're unique, they're funny, they're creative,
Hmm.
they're genuine, they're lovely. And we can maybe agree to disagree. And there's a possibility I could be wrong. And that's okay.
It brings up a point, and again, this is an interesting conversation because usually I've read books and I've prepared and I've dog-eared them or I've got notes, because I read them on Kindle. And this is a different conversation because it's just a conversation. It seems to be merging with the ones we've been having privately ourselves on FaceTime and when we talk. But what happened to me, I'm the Francis Schaeffer son, and I walked away, became a critic of evangelicalism and right-wing Christianity in general, and certainly have, from the point of view of where I would have been when I was, say, 20 and working with my dad as his sidekick, have, quote, lost my faith and abandoned it. When I look at the Graham family, I'm talking to you, one of the leading right-wing firebrand Trump supporters in America right now is Franklin Graham, who is related to you. How is he he's your uncle, right?
He's my uncle, and my mother, Gigi, is referred to.
Yeah.
She's the oldest of the grandchildren, and Franklin's her brother. So he would be
And
my uncle.
he's the youngest child.
No, he would
Like,
be the middle, I
because
think.
how many grandkids were there? There was
Ah,
Gigi, five. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, I've lost track of where he was.
yeah.
But the funny thing is, as a young man, he always had the reputation. I kept sort of track of him because I met him once. When we were both 9 years old. I think we're about the same age. And he came to
Yeah.
Switzerland to Lebrida, my parents' family. Um, and then in his teen years, I remember my mom talking to Ruth, your grandmother, Ruth
Mhm.
Graham, and she telling my mom, "Oh, please pray for Franklin. He's having so much trouble, and he's really, using the terminology of the time, he's far from the Lord, and he's rebellious, and so forth and so on." Um, and then he went from that to picking up the reins within the organization
Mhm.
and so forth and so on, and now has become one of the MAGA leaders in America on behalf of Donald Trump. Most Americans, when they hear his name, don't even think of the Billy Graham organization. Now they think of Donald Trump, and he's an appendage to that movement and will be seen that way forever in history outside of the evangelical circle that would know him a little better theologically, but
Mhm.
that's who he is now. And I don't want to put you on the spot because this is family. And you can ask me some hard questions too, but what happened there? Because that I can tell you one thing I know, since I knew his dad a little bit, and my father knew Billy quite well, and of course I knew his mom. Franklin's public persona, um, let me just put it directly.
Mhm.
Ruth Graham would have vomited at the Trump presidency because I
Mhm.
knew Ruth, and Ruth hated that sort of person, and she hated that kind of persona and was always warning her own husband not to be seen as too absolutist, let alone mean-spirited. the
Mhm.
fact that the fact that Franklin has wound up there, um, for instance, writing something criticizing Republicans who voted against Trump when came to the impeachment and casting them out and really kind of almost painting a target on their back, um, I think would have shocked Ruth where he's wound up far more than where I wound up would have shocked my mom. I
Mhm.
know what my mom thought of my departure from evangelicalism, and it wasn't that shocked because she was kind of like you, we can all get along and keep talking.
Mhm.
Um, I can't think of a public persona other than Trump himself further
Mhm.
away from either Billy Graham or Ruth
Mhm.
than the image that Franklin casts and the shadow he's casting. And I don't even know how to explain it because I never knew him well enough to say, well, there was this thing that happened. And anyway, I'm almost embarrassed to put you to that, but we're in the middle of an election cycle.
Yeah.
What the hell?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's such a great question, and you're free to ask me any question, by the way. And I
And you're
appreciate.
free to say, hey, this is family. Let's
Yeah,
move
yeah, no.
on.
And it is and in those kind of situations, and I've lived with it all my entire life, and so that's one of the benefits is that you have this you have to it goes back to that messy middle in that you
Yeah,
have this dichotomy that there's this one bucket that says this is family and
sure.
a deep love for family, though you may agree or disagree on certain
Yeah,
things, and that doesn't just have to be political. It can be on any, it
right,
can
right.
parent your kids, how to do life, how to marriage, how to spend your money, whatever. I mean, even with under the big broad umbrella of the Graham, family, Tchividjian family,
Hmm.
all of our extended families together. I mean, I've got a few of my siblings that will get on social media and troll my Uncle Franklin, and they have
Well, and
radically.
you've got a brother. Isn't Boz your brother?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, you got a brother who's famous. I just interviewed, where is her book here? Not Krista Brown, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, the book you told me about. Right.
Yeah, that I just interviewed where he wrote the foreword, and it's a
Right.
terrific book by a lawyer who outed the Southern Baptists for not investigating sexual abuse. So that's
Right.
your brother. And
Yeah.
he'd be about as far away, who basically has become the sworn enemy of the Southern Baptist Convention for not properly
He and
treating
I,
women. So
he and
your
I,
family is certainly not one-dimensional.
no, no, no. He and I just hiked Brute together a couple weeks ago, just
Yeah, and
FYI.
made me insanely jealous by I'm never going to
Sent him some
forgive
pictures.
you for sending me these pictures of the Matterhorn, telling me, here we are, wish you were here. It's like, yeah,
No, not the Matterhorn, Don DeMitti.
no, I know that, but you were at the
Yeah,
Matterhorn too.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. So no, so so when I look at someone, this is where the messy middle is because my Uncle Franklin's my Uncle Franklin. I love him as my uncle. There would be some things that he may say publicly or some positions he take that I wouldn't necessarily align in that particular thing, and that's where again the messy middle of the tension because just like I would with anybody else, I'm not going to say, well, I disagree with my uncle on this particular thing, so therefore
Sure.
I'm going to cut him off and lambast him as the evil of the world because he's still my uncle. But I
Yeah.
can agree to disagree on certain things. I also I don't understand the full journey. He wrote a wonderful book called Rebel with the Cause, which is in essence his was testimony to the point of grew up in the evangelical world, was a wild guy, everything else, and
Yeah.
came to be born again, and then the rest is history, kind of thing. So I don't have. I mean, I've obviously some view of the journey has been on in terms of what positions he's taken, why he's chosen to do that. He's definitely more verbal about the political arena than my grandfather was. My
Well,
grandfather,
and I remember your grandfather, Billy Graham, and my dad talking, and I heard this with my own ears, and
yeah,
Billy saying that he bitterly regretted the mistake he made in endorsing Nixon.
yeah, the
And this was
Nixon.
after Watergate, and Watergate was nothing compared to Trump.
No, and I
And
mean, he would say he got too
and he
close.
was saying, I'll never do it again because it damaged my ministry as an evangelist. I didn't, I got, why would I allow politics to damage my witness to Christ, of Christ?
Yeah. And
I
I think
can't,
that's I think that narrative is going on in the Christian circles at least the circles I'm a part of. And I'm no, elite Christian or anything like that. But the ones that I'm talking to, whether
oh,
it's
you're
a,
pretty elite. Your mother tells me that you're connected. Gigi last time said, hey, listen, if you need
yeah,
anything,
yeah,
talk to
I'm
Stephen,
I
talk to
mean, I'm
Stephan.
connected.
He knows everybody.
I'm connected. And in fact, I'm on your podcast. So that's pretty good.
But yeah,
Uh,
that's like I hope this is not the most,
so the deal is no, but I think the reality is, whether it's a pastor of a local church here in our community, or whether it's an quote unquote evangelical leader or whatever like
yeah.
that, there is a narrative going on behind closed doors about the disconnect that's happening within, where you've got those that are leaning much more politically and are voicing throwing their name in the hat and being very public
Yeah.
about positions. My uncle would be in that much more in that arena, and then you've got others that are just
Well, and your
shaking.
brother would too, Boz, but from as what somebody might call from the left, because he's a pro-feminist, anti-abuse spokesperson who sues people or defends people
So yeah, we talked
for
about that in
abusing
Brate.
women.
Yeah, and so yeah, and so that is where and without getting all I don't know the journey. So your question on how did it happen in Franklin's world and all that. I mean, obviously that's a Franklin question because I don't know exactly all the
Well, let
reasoning
me
and
put it this way: how often, when was the last time you talked with Franklin in person, face to face?
well, I probably talk to him on the phone 3, 4, or 5 times a year. The last time in person, I'd have to think about that.
And
It
you ever
was
get into any of this?
not really. I mean, I probably talked to him about a month ago on the phone about something, but not really.
Well, hey, and I've got a mea culpa here too, because
Yeah.
people will think I'm putting my old friend Stephan on the line here. I have family who are on the right. I have people who I used to be friends with or were closer to who are pretty far right, you know. So I'm not asking you anything that doesn't happen to
Yeah.
me all the time.
Well, yeah, I mean,
I totally get it.
I have two phone calls I need to make after you of Christian leaders who, called me yesterday and said, "Hey, Stephan, I'd love to unpack something because, I'm noticing this. I watched the GOP thing and I saw your uncle pray here, or hey, I've got a question about this, or I'm wrestling with it." I mean, that is my reality. So
Well, and half the people on that platform are people you know personally, probably more than that.
yeah, not that, no, not as much as you think. I don't. I
Put
try
it
to.
this way, I'm gonna look, because we know each other and I've got you on my speed dial, as it were, to put it in the old-fashioned terms. I know who to blame now for anything that goes wrong with the religious right. I'm calling you and saying, hey,
Yeah.
these are your people. What's your
All I know is
problem?
I keep my Swiss passport real close to me.
Because you do have a Swiss passport,
Yeah,
and there's a lot of
uh,
Americans who are saying if Trump wins, they're gonna be moving. So
so well, I am going back to that sense of, and I don't mean it to be like being spineless, this sort of the messy middle. I actually think it's harder to live in the messy middle than it is on the extreme left or the extreme right
oh, I
because you
totally buy that.
have to
And
live with 10.
my producer Ernie Gregg and I talk about this because we do this unforgivable thing of booking people and talking to people that we actually might disagree with. And then
Yeah,
we have a friendly conversation. And then we hear from some of our liberal friends who say, that's it. I'm never watching your podcast again because you had the editor of the Wall Street Journal on, which I did.
right. Yeah,
And why would you talk to someone like that? And it's like, hello, the word liberal sure has changed when we have blacklists that we can't now speak to because they don't have the same
right.
politics as us. I see it exactly the opposite. And that is that if you want to make a point about anything, you've got to have a broad conversation
You have to.
and do
No,
it
and you
politely.
have,
Otherwise, what's the point?
yeah, and you have to, and I wake up almost every morning, and I say in a brief prayer, God, help me be suspicious of myself.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning that I can talk to somebody who has extremely different political views than me or
Sure.
different whatever. And you know what? There's always something I learn in that conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not an all or nothing. There's always something that I learn. So, when we talk about what's going on with the Christian nationalism, all that, what's got me curious is and in fact, I enjoyed reading your book, Crazy for God, and, going back to all the early stages and some of your journey. What we're dealing with a lot in today in the narrative and all this extreme kind of stuff, that wasn't just birthed 4 years ago, 8 years ago, 10 years
Sure.
ago.
No,
This
absolutely.
has been birthed decades ago. So I do find myself curious because I'm trying to ask myself, how did we get to where we are and where are we
Mm-hmm.
going? Where does this end? It doesn't just end with an election.
No, not at all. And the election doesn't change, solve the problem, even whether you're. So let me just reintroduce you here. My name's Frank Schaeffer. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And today I'm talking with an old friend with whose family I go back into my childhood in the late 50s. So there you go. This is a long-term relationship. His grandfather was the Reverend Billy Graham, the evangelist. His grandfather was someone that I grew up knowing well because he lived nearby my parents' ministry of Liberty Fellowship and would come to our church services. And his name was Ari Tchividjian or Tchividjian. And I grew up with him as a big presence in my life. He was a formidable person
He was.
that cut a wide swath, an Armenian, a big personality. I knew him well. Um,
Yeah.
so Stephen currently serves as one of the founders and is president of the board of the National Christian Foundation of South Florida. He also manages his own consulting firm, the Caleb Group, specializing in assisting, am I getting this right? In assisting select nonprofits and for nonprofits with comprehensive project management. Stephen comes from an interesting heritage. We've talked about that. Born as the eldest grandchild of the Reverend Billy Graham, the evangelist. And then my little bullet points here. Please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts. And to my Substack channel, It Has to Be Said, wherein I make little statements at frankschaeffer.substack.com. By the
By the
way,
way,
the
subscriber, I
person
want
that I was talking about is Krista Brown, who wrote this book
to.
on the Southern Baptists, and she's the one that your brother Boz, who, by
Yep.
the way, is an advocate for women's rights and the right of women to be heard who have been abused in churches. And he's done things like sue the Southern Baptist Convention. So these grandchildren of Billy Graham are interesting guys.
By the way,
let me transition to something. Say what you're going to say, and then I'm going to transition.
I just want to say I'm a subscriber to your podcast. So
thank you.
I'm
my Substack.
Yes, I saw every month I get a bill on PayPal or something like
that. Good.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate it, and we need subscribers because none of this is for free. And Ernie is our producer and runs an office that makes all this happen. So thank you very much. And Ernie,
I wanted to be part of the effort. Help you out.
Thank you. And now you'll be answering questions from your evangelical friends who are saying, if you're a subscriber to Frank Schaeffer's podcast and send him money, we're done. So that's you're going to get the shit from everybody now. So anyway, let me cut to something else here in terms of just your own life and your own work. You have got your family nearby, as I do. We share so much in terms of our love of Switzerland, and one particular little piece of the Swiss Alps that we both know so well, because I grew up there, and you kind of did too, because your mom was in and out of there. But let me switch to gears here to talk about interesting things you do. You know, you were in Switzerland with a bunch of businessmen that you were introducing to Swiss businessmen. Your mom talks about the connections you have still within the evangelical world. You also have something you do that I find fascinating and I'd like to dig into. And that is you counsel pastors, preachers, who themselves are facing all sorts of issues and burnout in their lives. Very difficult path to be a pastor or the wife of a pastor. What is your insight into the trade of American pastoring right now in the climate we're in, where churches are either closing or getting smaller or huge, very politicized? Your Uncle Franklin Graham is a typical example of one side of the equation, and then Boz on the other, fighting for women against churches that have abused them. And you counsel pastors. I just find that's fascinating in a kind of a neuropsychology sense. What do you find, without naming names? What are the stories you hear? Where are these guys? You know, every time you see a pastor in the news, it's because he's just had some sexual liaison that's, pool boy, Franklin Graham. We knew, not Franklin Graham, Jerry's son, Jerry Falwell. Same kind of thing with the pool boy and all that. All you hear about is scandals if you're not in the mix. Mm-hmm. What's going on in there?
And it's a great question. I mean, we could probably spend hours thinking and talking, and I could learn a lot from you in that question. So I'm not coming with any expertise.
Yeah, but you talk to these gentlemen and these people all the time. And you're trying to help them. You're a counselor.
Well, I'm not actually a counselor. We create programs that create opportunities for them to get help from each other, create these peer groups.
That's a nice way to put it, but it's your deal. So tell me about it.
So, because I don't have the patience to counsel anybody. My dad was a counselor. He sat in his chair all day long, died at a young age. And I said, well, you sit in a chair listening to people's problems all day, that'll certainly kill you. So I'm probably not I don't have the deep patience, but on a much broader level, I do think from for people that are inside the church world or outside the church world, I think what's happening in the church world, particularly in the United States, I think it is going through a significant metamorphosis. And I think it's going through, my personal opinion, is going through a cleansing of what does it mean to be a church, and what does it truly mean to be a quote unquote Christ follower. I think it's become for the most part, it has become a machine. And so you have many people who have a calling on their lives to want to help people and serve God and so on and so forth. And I think their hearts are pure as they jump on, and then the machine just slowly eats them up. And they get to a place in their journey, in their place where I know many of the pastors that I've spoken to, there's again this tension of this almost a disillusionment of I knew why I did this for the first place, but now what I'm doing is so far different than what I wanted to do, and I feel trapped, I feel escaped, and all that kind of stuff. So, and then also what you mentioned, the business people that I take, generally as speaking, my skill set is I'm a connector. I like to connect ideas. I like to connect people. You know, if I look at the stars, I see the connection. It's sort of a natural skill set of mine. So, you know, I also believe that, you know, a lot of the good things that happen in a community, it's a holistic approach to the ills of our community. But a big part of that is the business community. It's what
Hmm.
a business people do. And so I think too much of the Christian faith has become formulaic. I think it's become divided. I think it's become, well, let the professional Christians, the pastors, the missionaries, the evangelists, let them go do it. And the rest of us just sort of eke out a living and, you know, sit in a pew, look at the pastor preach, throw some money at him and go back to what we normally do. I'm being
Hmm.
somewhat facetious, but I don't think that's the way God designed what the church is supposed to be. So I think it's going through a big change, and I think it's looking for an identity. I don't mean to throw every church under that same umbrella, but I find it very often the case. Yeah, there's bad apples in every single place that are people that are doing it for all the wrong reasons. But I find that most time the pastors I have met,
Hmm.
they their initial desire to be a pastor, what they would call in the Christian world the calling,
Sure.
their desire to be a pastor, came from a good place, came from a pure place, came from a sincere place. But then, you know, it came from, hey, I love people, I want to help people, to now I'm running a corporation, and I'm in budget meetings, and I'm thinking strategy, and I'm thinking marketing and
Yeah.
social media, and you know, some of that stuff is just you know, I am a self-professed Christian, but oftentimes I look at the Christian world or certain Christians and I go, but I'm not that. And so I'm going through, in some cases, sometimes an identity crisis, because I go, I
Hmm.
know who I am, but I look at that and go, but I'm not that. So
Yeah.
who am I? You know, that kind of stuff. And goes back to your original question, you know, who do you see yourself at? So, um, you know, and I remember I never rebelled. I didn't go through some of your experiences, but I remember intellectually, probably 18, 19 years old, went through my form of intellectual rebellion, which was, you know, do I call myself a Christian because that's all I've ever known?
Hmm.
And you know, if my grandfather was Henry Ford and I drove a Ford, and I go, well, Fords are the best, you know. But what if I
Yeah.
had grown up in a Buddhist home, in a Muslim home, agnostic home, atheist home? You know, would I have you know, would my beliefs be any different? And I
Hmm.
came to the conclusion that no, I do believe, but with the caveat of tremendous mystery, and I'm intrigued by a much more holistic approach to life. Though myself, you know, I'm a, I have no doubt of being an outspoken, you know, I'm a Christ follower. But like I
Hmm.
said, I go through sometimes that kind of pushback because I look at people that say the same things, and I go, not really that way, and that always makes you hesitant. I'm hesitant in some
Sure.
sort of to identify as a Christian.
Yeah.
So.
It seems to me that, you know, as we look around now, um, a good question that Ernie just sent me, which actually mirrors what I was going to ask myself.
Mm.
Um, a viewer just asked a question that Ernie's passing on that he liked. Would a focus on some form of Christian democracy help in dialogue between Christian nationalists and left-leaning evangelicals? Good question.
Hmm.
Christian democracy, just that idea, because I remember one of my dad's big points that I don't really agree with at this stage, but made sense in its own way, was that Western democracy, as we understand it, came out of the idea of Christian checks and balances, that we're all sinners and we need boundaries. And so, you know, you have separation of powers in government. You know, it all made sense at that point. You know, we now have for instance, a Supreme Court loaded with conservative Roman Catholics and others who definitely have become the servants of one politicized point of view and changed the way people see the court. Most people see the court.
Mhm.
Um, Nobody argues with the fact that Christianity has been politicized. Things are
Mhm.
happening now that in my childhood I never would have imagined, you know, back in the day. For instance, the whole charismatic movement, the Hispanic charismatic movement, the Pentecostals, suddenly, people like Paula White and others whispering in Trump's ear, kind of bringing him into, giving that agenda. I mean, how do you see those changes yourself within what's happening? Because I think you and I could agree together 100% that the evangelical world that we're in right now is so different from the one we grew up in terms of how it's seen, just that, let alone emphasis.
Yeah.
I mean, back in the day, people looked at Billy Graham. They might not have bought his idea that, Jesus saves, but they didn't dislike him.
Right.
And they
Yeah.
didn't think he was trying to sell something that, under the guy, nobody mistook what he was saying for being told how to vote. And when he
Right.
got close to that with Nixon, he regretted it. I don't think anybody who's not my age or your age, who comes out of the evangelical background, younger friends of mine who are liberals on the left, Democrats, when they talk about evangelicalism, they're describing something that I never knew as a younger
Right.
person. I mean, this is so different than the landscape I grew up in. It blows my mind, irrespective of your views.
Yeah. No, and I think you word that right, and it has definitely changed. And I go back. I am anchored to this wonderful childhood that I was blessed with, that I had nothing to do with, other than I was placed in the right place at the right time. But when I look back and I see what was modeled for me, and again, behind closed doors, also in public, certainly not perfect at all, but there was an authenticity about it, and there was a bigger, larger than life kind of perspective to it, that sort of rode higher, in a higher orbit
Yeah.
than the political left or the right, or this and that. And again, I think you do a good job in your book, Crazy for God, sort of talking about sort of some of the early stages of the development of the religious right, the moral majority, and there was this sort of assumption that if we can just vote all the right people in all the right offices, we'll have the most wonderful nation. Well, that doesn't even work for the local church. I mean, I work in a community where we spend a lot of time just trying to get churches to come together and like each other. And you can't even do that among people who are all self-professed Christians and followers of Christ and preach God's word every Sunday. I go, how would it be ever different if they're all sitting in Congress, So, so there's that. And so I think for me personally, I'm very comfortable with the mystery. I'm very comfortable with ambiguity. But I also am having to constantly be reminded of floating in a higher orbit. Recently, I mean, for example, the mayor of our city here in Fort Lauderdale, he does a wonderful job. He's a wonderful, I think he's been a great mayor. He's an openly gay mayor, and he's proud of being a gay mayor, one of the largest city, that kind of stuff. And he and I will have lunch a couple times a year, just the two of us, just have a conversation. And usually it's around my role, and he knows me as, oh, you represent the church world, you're a Christian and all that. And usually our conversation centers around me saying, thank you for leading so well. And how can we come along and help you solve some of the problems my tribe, I guess, and then, and that's part of the narrative. And the other narrative is him saying to me, hey, Stella, help me understand why the church community hates gay people so much. So we have these honest conversations. It's not formulaic. It's not, well, here's a 3-point sermon. It's not, Mr. Mayor, if you just change this, this, and this, you'll be a perfect human being. But there's a mystery to the fact. He grew up Greek Orthodox. He has a fascinating story. And I love that dialogue. And so and we have that dialogue, and we can agree to disagree on certain things. We agree on probably more than we realize. But this is where I think the evangelical world that you're describing, that was what I was exposed to. My grandfather was willing to, yes, he got a little too political sometimes. And I think there's a seduction to power that, that is something that you have to be very, very scared to. To be the issue he had with Nixon And again, we know he and I never spoke about it. It's just stuff that I was either read or told. But a big part of it is when you
Let me
get,
give you a context to something that's apropos of this, and I'm not interrupting you, and you're 10 years younger, so you're going to remember what you're saying. If you interrupt me, I will forget because I'm in the
this
Biden
is a
bracket.
conversation.
Apropos of which, when I heard him talk about the fact he regretted committing to Nixon as DP, do you know what the context was?
No.
It was Billy Graham and my dad, Francis Schaeffer, and me
Hmm.
sitting down in Billy's room in the Methodist Hospital Mayo Clinic where he'd come for an extended checkup because he'd been having some health issues. My dad was across the street getting chemotherapy.
Mhm.
And Billy was begging my father to back off on his anti-abortion commitment and
Hmm.
saying, the reason I am for legal abortion and will not stand against it is because my job as an evangelist is to preach to women
Hmm.
and preach to men the love of Christ, not judge them.
Yeah.
And Fran, I think you're making the same mistake I made. This is
Hmm.
Billy Graham talking to my
Yeah.
dad, who had gone to see Billy to say, why aren't you supporting us?
Hmm.
And my dad was leading a, believe this or not, I'm not making this up. Daddy, and I have pictures of this, was on the street leading a picketing of Methodist Hospital that was doing abortions and staying in the Catholic Hospital, St. Mary's, where they wouldn't do abortions on principle when he
Yeah.
was getting his chemo treatment. Goes across the street after the picket, still in his suit and tie, sits at Billy where he's there for a checkup and tells Billy Graham, you should be standing on this issue, Billy. Why are you not standing with us? And Billy said, because I think it's a terrible mistake you're
Yeah.
making, Fran. And I made the same mistake when I got too close to Nixon. Our business, Fran, is the love of Christ. It's not American politics.
Yeah.
That was the context in which I heard him say that to my father. And
Yeah.
so when I see Franklin up on that platform
Yeah.
and people tell me that I have departed from my background, I'd say, no, I'm much closer to Billy Graham. This is weird than I am, than Franklin
Imagine you
is.
say that. Well, and it's consistent with some of the things that I heard and saw. Like, I mean, my grandfather would be on Larry King Live, and during some of the pro-life movement and the marches and all the
Mhm.
Operation Rescue things and all that, there would be times when he would be asked, like, with your platform, or his fellow Christian friends would say, Billy, when you are on Larry King Live, you need to take a strong stand on X,
That's what
Y,
my
Z.
dad was telling him.
Yeah. And he was one of the, I mean, Billy Graham is not a perfect figure and in some cases a controversial figure, but he was at least sincere to, hey, I have been called to, and again, in the Christian terms, I've been called to preach the gospel, and that
Right.
word means good news. In other words, the good news of God's love, the good news of God's redemption. I'm a good news teller. That's my thing.
Well, and Billy saw himself as doing what Jesus did, as in hanging around with all the sinners that the Pharisees were criticizing. And he said, I'm trying to follow Jesus that hung around with the whores and the sinners and the
Right.
tax collectors. Why are you telling me to set up an organization and judge them?
Well, and the bigger the audience, the greater. I mean, and so to your point, and what I had been exposed to, the minute you begin to take a certain cause that then immediately differentiates, well, this group is in and this group is out, then that group is never going to listen anymore to the quote unquote good
Which
news.
is where
So,
we're at now. And I want to get to this question. So I'm going to ask it now. I think you have a lot of wisdom, and you're someone who certainly knows the territory better than anybody we've talked to on this program. We've had some historians and well-known authors who study all this from a distance or from university campuses, but you're in it.
mhm.
So whither evangelicalism now? Forget who's right and who's wrong. Where does it go from here? Because its image, here's my opinion. I think Trump has done what no atheist could have ever done.
Mhm.
Although Trump may be one. I mean, the new atheist movement with all those people who were writing about it never was able to lay a finger on Christians because faith is faith. But I think Trump has managed to destroy the witness of Christ in America for the next 100 years, if it ever
Mhm.
comes back. And it's
Mhm.
finished. I mean, this is an irredeemable image. It's not just an
Mhm.
image problem. The product is done.
Mhm.
Not that there aren't still Christians who are sincere. That said, where do you think it goes from here? Because
Right.
I don't see a future for white evangelical American Christianity as anything other than a very powerful, dangerous political movement that
Yeah,
has nothing to do with anything I was raised on. And I'm not talking about individuals or the pastors you're talking to or
right.
the individual churches that are every church is this way. No, not saying that. I mean, here we are talking and you're not that person. But
Yeah.
I think, in terms of the broad stroke of history, Billy's worst fear
Yeah.
when he was rebuking my dad and telling him, "What are you doing, Francis? This isn't what we do," has been
Yeah.
realized.
Well, it's interesting because Christ in his teachings warned his particularly his disciples. I don't call them disciples, I call them interns, because today's
Yeah.
word, everybody knows what an intern is. Nobody knows what a disciple is. So Jesus had these interns, and he warns them about there were two groups of people. They called them the Pharisees and the Herodians, or the followers
Mm,
of Herod. So it was the political elite and the religious elite, and he warned them, be careful of those two, the political elite and the religious elite. And he says
mm,
they're like a poi. You use the word yeast. It goes. I mean, he says it's like they get into the crevices and they're toxic. And
mm,
he look out through church history, and anytime that group got together, it was always a bad thing. It never ended well. And I
mm,
think we're going through something like that. I think I don't know what it looks like 20 years from now, 30 years from now, but I'm personally, this is me speaking, I'm no authority, but I'm personally that the influence of the general quote unquote Christian audience, or Christian tribe is lessening and becoming more and more irrelevant.
mm,
There needs to be that metamorphosis, and I think it will get worse before it gets better. Church history has, and again, coming from my particular worldview, I think church history has shown that it's resilient, even if it gets brought down to the nub and
mm,
to the original core, and then it has to grow back up. Because what I see and experience for a lot, I'm not saying always. Now, again, I'm not
mm,
throwing
mm,
one big group, but it is oftentimes I do scratch my head and to think, if Jesus showed up today and hung out around a bunch of Christians or sat in our local churches, would he feel at home and go, yeah, that's what I meant? Or would he just shake his head, goes, this is completely not what I had in
mm,
mind? I mean, I try to sit in when I'm with a bunch of Christians and I'm sitting there again, and there many of them are my dear friends, and I will in my head pretend I'm not a Christian. I'll take off my Christian hat, and in my
mhm,
head, okay, I'm not a Christian. I'm just sitting here listening to this, and there's, I mean, some of it's sweet and precious and all that, but a lot of it is just because this is so completely irrelevant. And the illustration I used, I think once with you maybe, was, if there's a lot of statistics out there where young people are running from the church, want nothing to do with the church, all these interesting statistics, and the church world seems to be all up in arms and blaming a lot of things like social media and liberal stuff, and I'm sure there's an element of that. I don't know, but I'm much more in the camp of going, take a look at ourselves. So as
mm,
a father, if I come home and my kids are at the front door or in the house, and I come home and my kids see that I'm home and they run out the back door, and
mm,
because they want nothing to do with me, the solution isn't lock the back door.
yeah.
This, I have to at some point be honest enough and go, what is it wrong with dad that the kids want nothing to do with it? So, and I think today's church needs to say, what is it wrong with our narrative and who we are,
Mm,
that the increasingly more and more people are going, I want nothing to do with what it is that you are offering or espouse, and all
mm,
that kind of stuff. And we could talk a lot about that particular issue, but there's this Bible verse in the New Testament that says, be ready always to give a reason of the hope that's in you, and do it with gentleness and respect. And
mm,
I always thought it was, oh, I had to give a lot of good factual reasons why God exists and all. No, it was, no, Stephan, live a life of hope, so that one day, or Frank is Schaeffer is living a life of hope. I go, Frank, you have hope in your life. I don't have hope. What is it about your life? Now you, with gentleness and respect, share with me. What? Just share my story. So I think we've missed that for the most
mm,
part in the Christian world.
mm,
There's not a lot of gentleness and respect. We're not walking around with a lot of hope. There's a lot of despair. We versus them. The big they are taking away our freedoms. They are taking all that. maybe there's elements of truth to that. Maybe there's, I don't know. But the reality is, I need to be a man or a woman as I go by my life as a purveyor of hope in
Mhm.
an increasingly hopeless world. And that could just be gentle acts of kindness, you know, calling, being a friend to my mayor. I hope that when he has lunch with me, he walks away going, I'm encouraged. That's it. And my grandfather had a wonderful thing. I'll tell you another Billy Graham short story, but he was invited to the Time magazine, whatever it was, there all the people had been on
Sure.
the cover of Time magazine, some big gala, and this was right when Clinton and the Monica Lewinsky thing was coming, and all the handlers behind the scenes. There was a big debate. My mother was invited, and she went with my grandfather. That's why I know the story. And all the handlers were like, should Billy Graham sit with Bill Clinton or not? And it was a big controversy because Bill Clinton was a lightning rod to the Christian world at the time, and my grandfather insisted, no, I want to sit at the same table. And my mother
Mhm.
asked, how do you process all that? And he said something, it's simple, but it's profound. He goes, my job is to love. Let God be the one to judge. And then again, in the Christian vocabulary, we talk about God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And
Sure.
he says, let the Spirit of God be the one to convict. So I don't have to go in there as a judge, and I don't have to go there as the convictor. I'm going
Mm.
to go there with one assignment, and that is to love the people that God places in my path
Mm.
and stop trying to fix everybody. And I think that's part of the Christian world. And if we can get political power to fix this and financial power over to fix things, and we've got this insatiable appetite for power, and Jesus was the antithesis of that. I mean,
Mm.
in fact, he had an upside down world, and I think we've lost a lot of that.
Mm. Yeah, and the temptation here is to talk to you as if somehow you represent that, but I know you don't, because I know you and we talk privately as well. So I'm going to leave it there and thank you for a really good discussion. Ask you to say hi to Gigi for me. I'm sorry she's not feeling great right now. And this has been an incredible pleasure. Um, and just a lovely conversation. Plus, it's good for people who listen to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer and my podcasts and all these other things to understand that my point of view is represented in this talk, and that is that I'm far away from my evangelical background, and yet you and I sit here and chat
Yeah.
as people who basically believe in a lot of the same things. And that's the hope for me of the future of this country. I think in that sense, whether it's ideology or theology, the hope for me, I know this will sound weird,
Yeah.
is I think we are all better than our theology.
Mm.
There's something deep in the human spirit that is better than the ideology we attach ourselves to, left, right, and center. This conversation represents that to me. So, Stephan Tchividjian, um, I love your mom and I've loved your family. And I'm sorry about Franklin. He's the black sheep, not me. If you want to end on a jokey note here. But that's how it is. So anyway, this has been just great. And let's keep talking
We
here
will.
and other places. And thank you for subscribing to my Substack channel.
I'm honored to. Thank you. I appreciate you.
Yeah, me too.